Can't round out chapter 16, shall we? So so here we go. Last time we left off, we're talking about autonomic nervous system. We're kind of rounding the home stretch of autonomic nervous system. And so a couple of things. First of all, understand where the autonomic nervous system, just to remind you guys, is split up in between two different divisions, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And so typically all of your visceral core systems are innervated by both, right? So oftentimes you actually have two physiologies in your body. You have a physiology of rest and you have a physiology at stress, a stress physiology, right? So basically you're at rest, you're at peace, you're resting and digesting at your parasympathetic, or you're running for your life because the lion is chasing you. That's your sympathetic, and you're constantly toggling back and forth between the two. So what that basically means is that most organs that you have are innervated by both, right? So it's kind of like flipping a switch. You have to know when to sort of move into sympathetic mode versus parasympathetic mode. And so, like for instance, your fight or flight response, your sympathetic mode, you're going to see pretty much everything that you need in order to survive. In this case, survive running from the lion, right? So if you're running from the lion, you're going to have to do physical activity, physical stress. So you have to contract your muscles. You have to run like the wind. You have to breathe in order to deliver oxygen to those muscles. And you have to generate energy, right? So for instance, in order to get the oxygen into you, you're going to dilate your air passages. That basically brings in the O2. You're going to increase your heart rate to deliver the oxygen to the muscles. You're going to dilate your vessels, your blood vessels, to basically increase the load, the blood load that you're delivering to your muscles. And so in addition to that, you're also increasing your glucose production, which a lot of times throws students because they're like, wait a minute, why do you do that one? Simple, right? Because you don't only just need oxygen to contract your skeletal muscles so that you can run like the wind, but you also need energy to power that contraction. We learned that the sliding filament theory, we learned this in chapter 9, contracting your muscles requires ATP in order to attach those myosin heads, pull, and then let go, and then attach, pull, and let go. So you need ATP to do that, and you get your ATP from glucose production. So if you're contracting your muscles more to run from the lion, you have to make more energy to power the contraction of those muscles. That means you need more glucose production. You're also going to increase your body temperature. Why? Because your muscles are contracting. Remember, your core body temperature actually comes from the contraction of your muscles. That's actually what creates most of your body heat, is the contraction of your skeletal muscles. Now, it's going to be accompanied by a powering down of things you don't need. For instance, you don't need to be digesting right now. Let it go. So you're going to be powering this one down. Also, urine production. You don't need to be making urine at this particular point. You've got other fish to fry. Who cares about digestion or urine production if the lion eats you, right? So in this particular case, you have to make sure that you're letting go of the things that you don't need and that you're ramping up the things that you do need. The idea here is run like the wind and live another day, right? Of course, parasympathetic is going the opposite direction. So in parasympathetic, this is basically going to be powering functions that are associated with your resting conditions. For instance, now is the time for you to digest, right? You're at peace, you're sitting under the shade now because you've run from the lion. And now you have a little bit of moment of peace, so you can sort of lay down and sort of digest a little bit. You can take care of your waist. You can lower your heart rate. Why? Because your muscles aren't actively contracting. We did this last week, didn't we? We ate probably a lot more glucose than we needed. And so we did a lot of digestion. And the average activity on Thanksgiving Day has a lot more to do with the couch than it does with shopping. And so it's pretty common for us to basically overeat on these eating holidays. Pick your eating holiday of choice. And then we typically like to sort of lay down, right? Or we like to rest afterwards. And that's a pretty common thing because that's what you do in your parasympathetic division. It's the rest and digest division. You've eaten, now go digest. Lay down under the shade, of a nice tree somewhere in the grass and digest, take care of your waste, your urine production. Of course, since you're not contracting your muscles, you don't need a lot of energy. So you don't need a lot of oxygen either. And so you lower your heart rate because your demand has gone way down. And you're not breathing, perhaps you're not breathing at all because you ate way too much. I know I've been there, right? When I've way overeaten on Thanksgiving Day, and it's like I just sort of lay on the bed trying not to move too much so that I keep my air open. The idea is just keep breathing and then let the digestion sort of move everything else out. And so that's kind of how some of those days work. I know some of you guys did that. So here's kind of a nice little, this next couple of tables, basically, there's a lot of detail in these tables, and we'll take a look and kind of pick different pieces of this as well. These three tables basically are painting a picture. And they're painting a picture of how the sympathetic and the parasympathetic work together in terms of toggling back and forth between regulating these different functions between this fight or flight or the rest and digest. So the first place we're going to start off with is with what looks like mostly largely sympathetic types of scenarios. So for instance, we're going to have a list of our effectors over here. This is basically what's being changed, what body system or core visceral organ is being changed, and what the sympathetic effects or the parasympathetic effect and the receptor type are that's involved in this particular situation. Now, I don't want to pick away at every line. I want to kind of graze over this a little bit. I'm going to cherry pick out a few things to paint a bit of a picture. One thing I don't want you to get too hung up on right now is all this sort of Greek lettering here, right? Alpha and beta, alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, and beta 2. Don't worry about that one so much right now. Just suffice it to know that those are receptor types. We're going to talk a little bit more about those receptor types here in just a little bit. But when you take a look at some of your effectors, you notice all these, for the most part, on this particular section of the table, are largely under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is associated with you running away from the lion. It's all about energy. It's about energy production, energy acquisition, energy delivery, and things of that nature. So you have basically adipose breakdown, fat breakdown, so you can get energy from it. There is no parasympathetic side to this one. For your erector pili muscles, what are those? Those are the muscles in your skin that make your hair stand on end. And so these will contract under sympathetic stimulation, like when the hair on your neck stands on end. Those are governed by alpha 1 receptors. Blood platelets will increase your coagulation. Blood vessels will typically constrict and or dilate, right? So for instance, some of the organs will constrict. The heart, that basically shuts them down, essentially. Your heart will either constrict or dilate, depending on which receptor you go after, alpha 1 or beta 2. Your kidneys, again, alpha 1 or alpha 2. Dilation is beta 1 or beta 2. Your lungs will either constrict or dilate, depending on which receptor you activate. Your skeletal muscles will constrict or dilate, depending on which receptor you dilate or which receptor you activate. Your skin and your veins, that's basically in your body carrying blood away from your tissues, will also either constrict or dilate, depending on whether you're activating the alpha receptors or the beta receptors. So from this one, notice what's happening is you got dual control. Constriction, dilation, that's the overall theme that we see repeating over and over again. So what this essentially means is that depending on which receptor you activate, you're going to either get an exciting type of response or an inhibitory type of a response. And so that's critical because we're going to catch that theme again a little bit later on. But notice none of these effector types have any kind of parasympathetic effect. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the duality, right? This is kind of like the push and pull, the give and take, the yin and yang of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. So when you take a look at the eye, for instance, the ciliary muscle, this is the muscle that's responsible for contracting your, when it contracts or relaxes, it basically focuses your lens in your eye so that it either shortens it or lengthens it so that you can focus on things far away or things close to you. So for instance, if it contracts, then you are looking at near vision. If it relaxes, then it's far vision, and you can see that you're activating different receptors there when you do that, either the beta 2 for the sympathetic or the M, which is muscarinic, for the near vision. Pupils will either dilate or they will constrict depending on whether or not you're activating the alpha or the M receptor. Your gallbladder is either relaxing or contracting. That's associated with delivery of bile, so that's going to be a digestive system situation. Your glands also will be responded to by both, right? For instance, your adrenal glands will either release epinephrine or norepinephrine. That's a sympathetic effect. That's essentially a nicotinic type of receptor, or there won't be any release, right? That's the parasympathetic. It's either on or nothing. Now the gastric, where this is all stomach, this is, you'll either have gastric secretion under sympathetic, or you'll have increased gastric secretion. So you'll decrease it or increase it. Notice this goes along with the idea that when you are in sympathetic mode, you're shutting down the digestive system. And so when you're decreasing that gastric secretion, you're shutting down the regulators that would allow you to digest. In your lacrimal system, you have a little bit of tear production in the sympathetic. You have increased tear production in parasympathetic, right? When your life is at stake, it's not the time to cry. Save that energy for some other time. Cry afterwards. Right now, just run, right? And so anybody who's been like in a high stress situation, like in battle, for instance, they oftentimes know that what that effect, right? It's kind of like a delayed effect. It's like their body doesn't function normally because they're under such enormous stress. And it's not until afterwards that they kind of decompress and they just start crying. Matter of fact, you see this a lot of times in soldiers, where at times, like after a battle, soldiers will be tough as nails. And then after the battle, they just break down crying. Because it's just like, it's just kind of like, it just kind of all comes apart, right? But that's because your body said, listen, when the bullets are shooting your way, you need to focus. Now's not the time, right? You need to stay focused. Your pancreas, notice the decreasing your insulin. What does insulin do? It regulates your blood glucose. Now, it regulates your blood glucose in response to digestive system. It's what you just ate, which is the reason why it decreases it. Also, the exocrine secretion, that's associated with digestion as well. So you're shutting down your digestive system in this particular case. You're increasing it with the parasympathetic. For the salivary gland, you have constriction of your blood vessels and a little bit of viscous saliva, but not a lot, right? Matter of fact, when you guys get nervous, a lot of times, like if I made you stand up in class and teach the class, a lot of you would start to get symptoms of dry mouth, right? When you get nervous, that's because your sympathetic nervous system is shutting down your salivary glands. Why do you salivate? You salivate so that you can get ready for the food that you're about to eat. So it's only in parasympathetic that you see copious saliva being produced, because you're getting ready to eat food, right? Under sweat, so the apocrine glands. So typically you'll have a lot of thick secretion. The apocrines, by the way, those are the glands in your armpits and also in your genital area, right? So this will increase sweating. This is one of the reasons why when we get nervous, right, we just start sweating. Like that's upregulated during the sympathetic. Also, other areas like especially the palms and the soles. Like when you get sweaty hands, it means you're getting nervous. Your sympathetic nervous system is shooting up. But there is no alternative stimulation on the parasympathetic side, right? So that upregulation of sweating is a sympathetic situation. Now, it's a different discussion to ask why. Like, what could possibly be the benefit of sweating in terms of surviving? Everything else makes sense because you have to contract your muscles to run from the lion. But what does sweating possibly do for you, right? I mean, it'll just make you a mess. Well, one of the things is, first of all, if you're sweating from the armpits, that's basically the smelly areas, right? So it could be, if you want to think about it in this terms, biologically, right? It could be thought of as that might be a type of a response for us for two reasons. Number one is it'll produce an odor that the predator doesn't like, right? So it's kind of a defensive mechanism. If I stink, you're not going to want to eat me. Problem is, we don't actually make the smell. We make the sweat, but it's the bacteria that breaks down that apicrine sweat that creates the smell. It's their byproducts that creates the smell. So that takes a little while. The other one could also be that it's like a signaling sort of a thing, kind of the way prairie dogs signal to each other when there's danger, right? So this idea that if we kind of start producing a smell, other members around us can smell us and say like, oh, you smell like fear. Yeah, because there's a lion right here. So if I smell like fear, that means you probably need to be afraid too. Because I may be the first one, but let me tell you something, you're the next one. So that could be kind of a communication strategy. So when we take a look, and this is kind of like moving forward as well. So if you take a look at the heart, in the sympathetic mode, you're going to increase your heart rate and also the force of contraction. Why? Because you're basically delivering more oxygen to the muscles that need it. And also during parasympathetic, you're decreasing that rate of contraction because you don't have the same demand when you're at rest, right? You don't have that muscular contraction demand. Liver is releasing glucose into the bloodstream so that your muscles can have energy to burn, so that they can contract. Your lungs are dilating their airways so that you can actually get more oxygen. In the parasympathetic, you're basically ramping that down, right? Because you don't need a lot of oxygen because you're at rest. And so you don't have a lot of need for that. Metabolism is going to be upregulated significantly under sympathetic because now everything is at full tilt. You're turning on the jets, you're turning on the afterburners, and of course in the parasympathetic there's no upregulation, right? Your sex organs, the parasympathetic the sympathetic is associated with a lot of the sexual functions like erection, ejaculation, things of that nature. Notice erection actually has kind of a dual innervation, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. So that's kind of an interesting duality in that one. Of course, your skeletal muscles are going to be breaking down glycogen to make glucose. That's so they can get that energy. Your stomach, remember this is digestive. The wall of your stomach is going to be decreased in tone. That basically means the musculature of your stomach wall is going to be decreased in tone, whereas in the parasympathetic, it's an increase in motility. Why? Because you need that muscular contraction in order to move the food around for your digestive system. If you're shutting down your digestive system because you're running from the lion, you don't need that motility, so it decreases the tone. In the sphincters, like your anal sphincter, for instance, and your lower esophageal sphincter, pyloric sphincter, you have increased tone, interestingly, under sympathetic, but decreased tone under parasympathetic. And so basically what that essentially means is you're going to be tightening those sphincters. You're less likely to open. So if you're not going to open, then everything kind of gets frozen in the shut state. So nothing's going to move through. That's because you've got all those sphincters closed off. So it's closed off valve. Your urinary bladder, the wall under sympathetic control is going to relax. Under parasympathetic, it'll contract. And there's different regions of the bladder. For instance, the wall will do one thing. The neck of the bladder, which is interesting, is the opposite. Under sympathetic, it contracts. Under parasympathetic, it relaxes. So different parts will relax and different parts will contract. The idea being that essentially you're sort of stopping the process, the normal process of urine flow and urine contraction by doing both of these. So the internal urinary sphincter, which is actually the one that is autonomic, under sympathetic is contracted. So basically it's closed off. And under parasympathetic, it's relaxed. Now, of course, this goes back and forth, right? That internal urinary sphincter, you have two different sphincters in your urinary system. The internal Urinary sphincter is the one that is autonomic, and that's the one that's always closed. When your bladder is full, that one gets autonomically signaled to relax, so it opens up. This outer one is skeletal. You have control of that one. That's the one that you cinch down when you're holding it. And so the inner one will be open when the bladder is full, but you open the outer one when you're ready to go, right? And so they're talking about the autonomic one here that's contracted under sympathetic versus parasympathetic where it's relaxed. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these neurotransmitters, shall we? So these are basically, we've been talking about neurotransmitters, it feels like forever, starting with chapter 9. Acetylcholine was the hot shot in that chapter, right, with the neuromuscular junction. Now, the acetylcholine is probably one of the more popular ones we talk about, but it's not the most important one or it's not the only one. But it is released by a type of neuron called a cholinergic neuron. And typically what you're going to see here is that the preganglionic neurons, we know what those are now, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions are going to release acetylcholine. The post-ganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division are going to release acetylcholine. And the sympathetic post-ganglionic neurons that are specific for thermoregulation and sweat glands. Okay. So in general, for the most part, though, that's where you have acetylcholine release. Now, norepinephrine is going to be released by what's called adrenergic neurons. And so these are mostly post-ganglionic with the exception of the sweat glands, right? So for instance, other types of things that you'll also find that these neurons will release are things like nitric oxide. That's also a type of neurotransmitter. Eicosanoids, gastrin, which is one of the hormones associated with regulating digestive function. Somatostatin, which is also part of the digestive system. Cholecystokinin, which is part of the digestive system. So is vasoinhibitory peptide. And enkephalins, or these are the natural morphine. Substance P, which is part of your digestive system, dopamine and serotonin, which are all part of mood, serotonin is, and dopamine is part of learning and also muscular coordination, and histamine, which is associated with your immune system. So these are all different things that these neurons will actually release. So there's a lot. If you think about this, it's a big profile of different things that they can release. Now let's take a look at the receptors. The receptors will basically reside on the effector cells. Or on the neurons, right? So a cholinergic receptor is essentially one that is going to be binding to acetylcholine. And there's two different types, right? There's what's called nicotinic and muscarinic. So the nicotinic receptors are typically going to be found on the postganglionic neurons, right? So this is basically going to be on the cell body portion where the dendrites are, on these postganglionic neurons. They're going to be found on skeletal muscles and also adrenal glands. So those are all going to be nicotinic in nature. Now, muscarinic are going to be found on parasympathetic effectors, right? This is the terminal point of a parasympathetic neuron, and also some sweat glands. Okay, so that's where you're going to find the muscarinics. Now, adrenergic receptors typically are going to be the ones binding to norepinephrine and epinephrine, which with varying effects. Now, there's a lot of similarities between these two. This is the reason why they're called the adrenalins. Together, they're called the adrenalins. They're not the same, but they do have similarities to them. So there's some overlap there. So they have different receptors that are designated by alpha and beta. This is what those alphas and betas were that you were seeing on those tables. And you have subdivisions of it. For instance, the alphas will be subdivided into alpha 1 and alpha 2, and the betas will have beta 1, 2, and 3. The alpha 1s and the beta 1s usually will have opposite effects from the alpha 2s and the beta 2s. So they act opposite of each other. Now, usually when you see these, they act in different ways. This is one of the reasons why we said that in some cases, they'll be excitatory, and others they'll be inhibitory. Generally speaking, when a neurotransmitter activates a receptor, it's what's referred to as an agonist, right? So basically it activates something. If it prevents an activation, it's typically called an antagonist. Okay, so it basically stops something from happening. And this is kind of the general effect. So this is what it looks like. So the nicotinic receptors, we'll start off with those guys first. These are the acetylcholine receptors, right? The cholinergic receptors. So these guys are going to be found on the cell bodies of postganglionic neurons, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And so these typically will have an excitatory effect. So basically, if acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic receptor, they tend to be excitatory, right? And so this is an example. This top one is an example of your nicotinic receptor. So you can see the acetylcholine is going to be released at this particular synapse. It's going to go across to these nicotinic receptors, and that's going to excite this postganglionic neuron. Now, the next one, muscarinic, this one is going to be associated with the effectors of the parasympathetic and some sympathetic effectors, like, for instance, the sweat glands. Okay. Now, if acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic, this could be excitatory or it could be inhibitory. It all depends on the effector. Remember, whether you excite something or inhibit something, it's not up to the neurotransmitter to determine that. It's what the effector cell does with that. So if I'm an effector cell and Sarah's an effector cell, and we both get acetylcholine, I may see that as an excitation. She may see it as an inhibition. It all depends on how we individually take that. So excitation and inhibition is associated with the effector, not the neurotransmitter. And so here you can see the muscarinic. So the nice thing I like about this is you can see the nicotinic receptors here on the cell body, but then down here on the effector, you can see the acetylcholine is released, and it's going to bind to the muscarinic receptors on the effector cell itself. Okay. So those are the two patterns of cholinergics that we see. Now the adrenergic receptors, remember these are those alpha and beta receptors. These are going to be associated with most of your sympathetic effectors. It makes a lot of sense, right? Adrenaline is associated with your sympathetic nervous system. And so binding of the norepinephrine on an adrenergic receptor can be either excitatory or inhibitory. Very similar to the muscarinic, right? It all depends ultimately on the effector cell. And so here you can see a nice kind of combination of the adrenergics. First of all, you can see upstream here the nicotinic receptors of the cholinergic type, right? Because they're accepting acetylcholine and it's going to a receiving postganglionic neuron. So that's nicotinic in nature. But then it's going to interface with these adrenergic receptors. And so they're going to bind to norepinephrine in this particular case. And these adrenergic receptors will then either excite or they'll inhibit the effector cell. Okay. So the thing I like about these images is you can see how these different sort of relay systems are connecting together. You're going from like an acetylcholine cholinergic driven nicotinic connection to another acetylcholine muscarinic connection. Or in this particular case, you're going from an acetylcholine cholinergic type of a connection with a nicotinic pattern, and you're connecting that to a postganglionic neuron that is a sympathetic postganglionic neuron that then connects with a norepinephrine, right, an adrenergic receptor at the site of the effector. That makes sense? So the story, to make it easy, is basically upstream, that is the connection between the preganglionic and the postganglionic is always the same. Acetylcholine, cholinergic in nature, with a nicotinic setup. After that, it's different, right? The postganglionic neuron then is different. It depends on whether it's a sympathetic or a parasympathetic nerve, right? So if it's sympathetic, it's going to be adrenergic, and if not, then it'll be muscarinic, right? A cholinergic type. And so you have a couple of different wiring systems, if you will, that you can look at there. So let's take a look at a couple of autonomic reflexes. The reflexes are important, right? Because an autonomic reflex is not like a normal reflex. It's not like knee-jerk reflex or pupil reflex like we learned about those somatic reflexes. These visceral reflexes are associated with controlling homeostasis in your visceral organs. It controls the way that your glands function without you thinking about it, the way that your blood vessels dilate and constrict all the time. They're doing that right now, actually, in response to keeping your blood pressure at an even keel. And so all of these are happening all at the same time. And so typically these reflexes are all influenced by the grand poobah that sits atop the endocrine system, and that's the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is actually what really controls the ANS. So the hypothalamus is sort of like the king of the ANS. Why? Because the autonomic nervous system isn't just nervously controlled, it's also heavily endocrinally controlled, right? So, and at the top of the endocrine system is the hypothalamus. And so a lot of your toggling back and forth between sympathetic and parasympathetic is associated with an endocrine response. As a matter of fact, epinephrine, adrenaline, is equal parts neurotransmitter and hormone. It's considered both, right? And so a lot of times neurotransmitters and hormones will be one and the same. And so this is important. This is one of the reasons why this is an important discussion, because when you get into AMP2, you start talking about this toggling back and forth between sympathetic and parasympathetic only with respect to the endocrine system as opposed to the nervous system. Now, ultimately, these divisions will not just work through the hypothalamus, but they'll also work through their own autonomic reflexes in the central nervous system. The one exception is the enteric nervous system, or the ENS is a sort of a wholly owned subsidiary of the vagus nerve, and its job is to pretty much just run everything in the digestive system. So it's got autonomy in the digestive system, and the central nervous system turns that over. So here's a good example. So here's a parasympathetic reflex that goes through the vagus nerve to lower your heart rate. So if we take a close look at this, first of all, what's going to happen is you're going to sense an increase in blood pressure that's a little too high, and that's going to be detected by baroreceptors that are going to be in your carotids. Those are going to signal cardiac centers in your brainstem, in your medulla oblongata, and that's going to relay the outgoing message through your vagus nerve to the ganglia that's actually in your heart, and then that's going to stimulate your heart to decrease, causing your blood pressure to decrease, bringing it back down to normal. And that's happening all the time, right? On the flip side of that, your sympathetic reflex is kind of similar, only in this case, you're looking at a decrease in your blood pressure, also detected by your baroreceptors in your carotid arteries. In this case, it's going to be carried by the glossopharyngeal nerve, just like it was before, where glossopharyngeal is cranial nerve number 9, right? And vagus nerve is cranial nerve number 10. So those cranial nerves come in handy every now and then, right? So what's going to happen is the decrease in blood pressure is going to go through the glossopharyngeal to your cardiac center, and then it's going to go down the spinal cord. It's going to move into the chain ganglia, and then the post-ganglionic nerve, which is called the sympathetic nerve, will increase your heart rate, causing your blood pressure to go back up. And so here you have two different reflexes keeping your blood pressure at an even keel. If it gets a little too low, you kick into the sympathetic reflex. If it gets a little too high, you kick into the parasympathetic reflex, and back and forth it goes. And so your blood pressure is constantly oscillating back and forth like a game of table tennis between these two reflexes, parasympathetic and sympathetic. And that's something that happens all the time. So here's a couple of different effectors, if you will, regions of the brain, because we talked about that in chapter 13, that affect your autonomic nervous system. For instance, your limbic system and your cerebrum, but your limbic system especially, right? Because this is where your emotions are. These will affect your autonomic nervous system, and they'll do so through your hypothalamus. Remember, your hypothalamus is the king, the very top of your endocrine system. And it's also right in there next to the limbic system, right? If we recall back, the limbic system is kind of right there next to the hypothalamus. And so when you get emotional, it affects your hypothalamus, which affects your hormones, which then has an effect on your autonomic nervous system. Your brainstem is important because in your brainstem, you have a lot of the visceral nuclei that controls your visceral systems. So all your reflex centers, like your cardio acceleratory center, your cardio inhibitory center, your vasomotor center, which is responsible for the constriction and dilation of your blood vessels, those are all located in your brainstem. So a lot of these reflexes are there in that brainstem area. Not just your heart rate, force of contraction, respiration, dilation, but also your tear production is there, salivation, your pupil dilation is there, swallowing is there, digestive activity. There's a lot of nuclei in your brainstem. This is one of the reasons why your brainstem is a really, 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 really super critical area of your brain. There are parts of your brain that you can live without, believe it or not. You can live without parts of your cerebral cortex. You wouldn't want to, but you could, right? But there's really not a lot of areas in your brainstem that you can't live without because there's just so many important critical autonomic nuclei in there. Spinal cord, of course, has different reflex centers associated. For instance, defecation and urination are there. Erection and ejaculation are also associated with the spinal cord, so there are some that are associated with that as well. So let's take a look at digestive, some autonomic and local reflexes associated, especially with the digestive system. We'll talk a little bit about the digestive system. We've got a little bit more of a discussion of ENS actually coming up here in just a second. So ultimately, when you look at local reflexes, you typically think of the enteric nervous system. So basically the digestive system is regulated with local reflexes due to the ENS. So the ENS is actually a series of plexes. One is called the enteric plexus. And the submucosal plexus. There's a couple of plexuses here. And we're a network of nerves, substation, if you will, like a little mini command center. And so what these guys are associated with is these are neurons that are in this enteric plexus. It's usually in the wall of the stomach. And so these neurons essentially are responsible for the smooth muscle contraction, the gland secretion. So like a local reflex, which you could think of as the ENS as a local reflex. It's a really significant, it's like a complicated, a tricked out local reflex. Is something that basically doesn't require the central nervous system to be involved, right? It can just take care of its own. It's got autonomy, right? So for instance, in the digestive system, they've got reflexes there. You can sense receptors that will sense the stretch of the wall of your stomach. And then it will basically immediately, reflexively act in conjunction to that, right? By basically contracting the smooth wall or the smooth muscle of the wall to kind of clamp down on it. So this is kind of like an important component. The enteric nervous system basically has these plexus systems. And what they do is they essentially coordinate the movements of pretty much your entire digestive system. So when you look at peristaltic, which is that kind of smooth, rhythmic contraction down your esophagus, kind of like you're squeezing a toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube, that's all peristalsis. That's under control in the enteric nervous system. The grinding, that's kind of what I call the washing machine contraction of the stomach, the way it kind of grinds and churns. That is also, it's a different type of muscular contraction. It's also under control of the enteric nervous system as well. The secretion of a lot of those hormones that we talked about, right? Like gastrin, for instance, cholecystokinin, VIP, right? So vaso interactive protein and others. There's others. Those are all under control of these plexus systems under the ENS. So all of the secretion of the hormones, the contraction of the muscles, in order to move food from point A to point B, to loosen up the sphincters so that you can move from food from the stomach to the small intestine and so forth. This is all under control, the ENS, right? This is basically all completely handed over to them. And so oftentimes when you have this dual innervation, these will have opposite effects. We saw that in those tables, right? So where they oftentimes will have similar effects, sympathetic will shut things down, parasympathetic will turn them back on, right? So they kind of work against each other. So what this basically does then is it allows you to kind of coordinate your activities of different visceral organs so that you can focus on one thing or not, right? So for instance, this allows you to having this dual innervation, allows you to be able to control all of your digestion with your parasympathetic division. And your parasympathetic division will hand that off to the enteric nervous system, which is a subdivision of that parasympathetic division. But they all work together to coordinate the activities under various types of scenarios, right? Because there are times when we need to sort of move into sympathetic mode. There are times when we need to move into parasympathetic mode. And so whether the lion is in the room or not, your body physiologically is constantly toggling back and forth between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And this dual innervation is what allows it to be able to do that. In some cases, both divisions work together at the same time, like sympathetic and parasympathetic, like for instance, erection and ejaculation. You're getting both sympathetic innervation and parasympathetic innervation at the same time because they both have slightly different roles to play in the same process. And so the important thing about this is not only do you have these sympathetic effects for the nervous system, but the important thing is it's always accompanied with hormonal control and release as well. So what we're telling you is half the story. Basically regulating sympathetic and sympathetic and parasympathetic from a nervous standpoint. But really the other half of the story is adding now the regulation and the coordination between the nervous system, parasympathetic, sympathetic control with the endocrine control of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And that's where the hormonal release and things like that work. Like for instance, the adrenal medulla will work together as an endocrine gland. The adrenal glands are an endocrine gland. They'll work together with the sympathetic nervous system to switch you to a sympathetic state. So a couple of the disorders that we have, Raynaud's disease, this is basically a spasmodic contraction autonomically. So you're not controlling your vasomotor centers well, so you're going to get spasmodic contraction. Your blood vessels, it typically leads to poor circulation, lots of problems with that, cold hands, ulceration, gangrene. You don't have good blood control or blood flow to your extremities, they're going to die, right? And that's what gangrene is. Basically, it's essentially tissue that dies because of lack of resources. You're not getting oxygen and nutrients to those cells, and they die. And eventually they just basically turn gangrenous. That's what gangrene is. Hyperhidrosis is basically excessive sweating. So if you're a Schwetzer, you sweat a lot. This is exaggerated sweating, right? So you have an exaggerated sweating, especially associated with sympathetic innervation. So if you like really sweat a lot, like abnormally so, that would be hyperhidrosis. Dysautonomia is a genetic disorder, and this is associated with gland secretion from your tears, also vasomotor control, which was similar to Raynaud's, a little bit different than that. But you typically also have problems swallowing and other symptoms. And notice what's happening here is these are all common. These are all smooth muscle problems. You have bad vasomotor control, that probably means that you have really poor blood pressure control and that you're not able to control your blood pressure with vasocontraction, vasoconstriction. So that's predominantly how you do that. So you're going to have some serious blood pressure problems and some serious cardiovascular problems because of that. So if you start messing up the blood pressures because of vasomotor control, then that's going to also feed back into the entire pressurized system, your cardiovascular system. It's going to cause a lot of strain and stress on your heart, which is going to lead to global wear and tear issues associated with cardiovascular. Trouble swallowing, I don't know about you guys, but that's terrible. A lot of times neurodegenerative disorders will have peristaltic breakdown and people will not be able to swallow. Like Lou Gehrig's disease, this happens, ALS. And so they'll not be able to swallow. And then when they're not able to swallow, then they start losing weight. They can't eat properly. And then it goes quickly after that. So there's a lot of problems associated with this one. Hirschsprung disease. This is a situation where you have a disruption in the peristaltic contractions of the colon, and it doesn't move the feces through the colon appropriately. And so what happens is it collects in that area. And so you start to have an accumulation of feces in that affected area because you're not muscularly squeezing the tube to get it through the colon into the rectum. And this could cause, obviously, a lot of problems. Right? So those are some major diseases associated with the autonomic nervous system. That's it. That's like seriously it. I'm done.